In chapter 11, we move to a unit on deciphering Earth's history. So, in this unit, we're going to focus on looking at how old the Earth is, how we understand that. We'll look at fossils and fossil distribution, and then we'll look at specific instances or specific areas where we can get a close up view of rock layers and what they can tell us about the history of the Earth. So we start out with catastrophism. This was kind of the first theory or first way that individuals would describe how the Earth was formed or how various landforms were formed. Catastrophism is the belief that Earth's various landforms and landscapes were developed by these catastrophic events. We of course now know that mountains and canyons take, thousands and millions of years to form, but those features of the landforms were explained as having been produced by sudden and potentially worldwide disasters, basically. And this kind of persisted during the 1600s and 1700s. And then in the late 1700s, James Hutton published Theory of the Earth. And in this book, he came up with this principle of uniformitarianism. Okay, and uniformitarianism has really become one of the fundamental principles of geology, and it says that right today have also operated in the geologic past. So basically, what he said is that the same types of mechanisms that we see today also existed in the past, and they're just continuing to function today. He said that processes that appear to be weak or slow acting can, over long periods of time, produce effects similar to those that could be caused by catastrophes or disasters. And as we saw in the last unit, we know that we have forces that act upon and within the earth that contribute to landforms and land masses and the appearance of topography. And so Hutton just kind of put that all together that said, yeah, we've got these processes, and just because we weren't around to see them taking place in far distant history doesn't mean that they weren't taking place. So the basic tenets that we had of uniformitarianism are just as viable today as they were in the 1700s when James Hutton was, making these principles and coming up with these ideas. Now, when we say that the same processes are occurring today as they did in the past, that doesn't mean that they're exactly the same, that they operate in the same way with the same speed and the same magnitude. We're just saying that the overall processes are the same. The acceptance of this concept of uniformitarianism meant the acceptance of a very long history for Earth. And that was the main sticking point, is that they thought that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. And modern geology suggests that the Earth is between 4.5 and 5 billion years old. And so it really was this huge turn of events for people to really wrap their head around how old the Earth really was. So how do we figure out how old the Earth is? How can we determine the age of rocks and the age of fossils? So we have to have a time scale. And without a time perspective, the different events that have occurred in history have little meaning. So we have to have a way to assign time and dates to events. So there are two types of dates when we look at a time scale for Earth's history. Numerical dates and relative dates. So a numerical date is the actual number of years that have passed since something happened. So a numerical date actually assigns a number to certain events. And so this really began during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And there weren't really any reliable efforts at that time to really allow them to determine a numerical date for how old the Earth was. Now we have radioactivity, which we'll get to in a little bit, that allows us to determine numerical dates. But what we have really been able to do is assign relative dates. And relative dates place rocks in a sequence of formation. So we're relating ages based on the layers of rock. So we don't know exactly how old they are, but we know which ones came first. And there are 5 different principles that kind of help us in the process of relative dating. So I'm going to show one of our smart figure videos. We're going to take a little field trip out west and talk about the 5 principles of relative dating.
In this video, we will fly around several locations in the western U.S. in order to illustrate principles of relative dating. Let's begin by looking at rocks at Flaming Gorge National Recreation Area in Utah. In this cliffside, you see layers of sedimentary rocks. You see layers of reddish rocks below layers of tan-colored rocks. The principle of superposition tells us that in a stacked sequence of rock units, each layer is older than the one above and younger than the one below. So here we know that the tan rocks are younger than the reddish rocks. The lower rocks had to already exist for the upper beds to be deposited on top of them. Here at Cedar Mesa in Utah, we see another sequence of sedimentary rocks where the older rocks must be those at the bottom, with the younger rocks above them. The principle of original horizontality states that layers of sediment are generally deposited in a horizontal position. If we find them to be horizontal, then they have likely not been disturbed by any crustal deformation.
So what you can see here is both the principle of superposition as well as the principle of original horizontality, that the oldest rock layers are going to be at the bottom, and as sediments are deposited, then each layer upon that is going to be younger, so that our oldest rocks are going to be down here at the very bottom and our youngest rocks are going to be up here at the very top. The other thing that we can see here is these horizontal layers, because as we looked at, with the rock cycle and with rock formation, we know that deposition is going to allow these to be laid down in horizontal layers. And so when we look at this, cliff face here, we can see all of these pretty much horizontal layers. And when we find areas like this that are still in their original horizontal layers, then we know that there hasn't been any type of crustal deformation or any type of movement that is allowing these to be disturbed from that horizontal superposition, basically.
These layers are old and have been eroded to create these canyons, but they are still horizontal. In contrast, the beds here at the San Rafael Swell are tilted. Since we know that they were originally horizontal, then we can infer that there has been some type of crustal deformation to tip them into their current orientation. The principle of lateral continuity is closely related to the principle of superposition and the principle of original horizontality. The principle of lateral continuity says that sedimentary beds originate as continuous layers that extend in all directions for great distances due to the extent of sedimentary environments. As we look out across the Dolores River Canyon, we can trace the thick, light-colored Entrada sandstone across the cliffs near and far. At the time when it was deposited, this sediment layer was a widespread and continuous unit that extended what is across now the valley, had it not been eroded by the Dolores River.
So in this principle, the principle of lateral continuity, they're showing you this particular type of rock here, the Entrada sandstone that you see here in the kind of this lighter band. And you'll notice there's an area missing here. And this was from the river. The river eroded here to produce this canyon, this valley. But we know that if these rocks were still here, that we would still see a band of this sandstone going right across the valley.
As we fly through this canyon, let's apply the first three principles. First, we see that the layers of carbonate rocks are dipping to the left, and so they are no longer in their originally horizontal position. Applying the principle of original horizontality tells us that there has been at least one instance of crustal deformation here. As we fly and gain a little altitude, we are moving up in this stratigraphic sequence of bedded rocks. We know that these are younger and younger beds because of the principle of superposition. Finally, the beds of limestone can be traced across from one side to the other by applying the principle of lateral continuity. Another tool that we can use to determine relative ages of geologic features is the principle of cross-cutting relationships, which tells us that geologic features that cut across rocks must have formed after the rocks they cut through. On the wall of rock here, there are sedimentary layers that are folded and have faults cutting through them. The actions of folding and faulting must have happened after the deposition of the sediments. The sedimentary rocks had to already exist in order to first be folded, and then for the folded layers to be displaced by the faults. Cross-cutting can also be observed in other geologic features such as intrusive igneous bodies, or even by rivers eroding down through layers of rock. Here we see a photo of an intrusive igneous rock. While the magma that formed this rock moved through the crust, it picked up pieces of broken crustal rock. This is an illustration of the principle of inclusions, which states that when one rock type completely surrounds another rock, then the one that is being included must be older. In other words, the included rock had to exist already at the time of the formation of the younger rock. Each of these 5 principles might seem obvious on its own, but by combining them we are able to determine a relative history of geologic events for a region. Look at this exposure of lava flows in a dike in Iceland. Can you interpret the geologic history by listing the features in order from oldest to youngest? Is it A, the higher layers of lava, the lower layers of lava, then the dike? B, the dike, the lower layers of lava, then the higher layers of lava? Or C, the lower layers of lava, the higher layers of lava, then the dike? The correct answer is C. The lower layers of lava are the oldest and were erupted first, while the higher layers of lava are younger and were erupted last. We know that the layers of lava had to be deposited one on top of the other because of the principle of superposition. The principle of cross-cutting relationships tells us that the dike has to be the youngest feature because it intruded into the entire sequence of lava flows. We could even apply one more instance of cross-cutting relationships because this valley wall was created when a glacier came through and carved this wide curved valley as it flowed toward the sea. Glacial erosion has to be more recent than the formation of the igneous features. In summary, the principles of relative dating are the principle of superposition, the principle of original horizontality, the principle of lateral continuity, the principle of cross-cutting relationships, and the principle of inclusions. These principles are particularly important because they can help geologists understand the relative timing of geologic events based on observations that are made in the field.
So in the video, you were able to see those 5 principles of relative dating. and how we can use those to understand the oldest features that occur in a landform versus the newest features. So when we look at layers of rock that have been deposited without interruption, we call those conformable layers, conformity. Anything that disrupts that is called an unconformity. So this is when we get essentially a missing piece of the rock record produced by times when there was no deposition and we had erosion. And there are three basic types of unconformities: angular unconformities, non-conformities, and disconformities. And we're going to see another smart figure video using the figures on page 353, where we can see how each one of these can be formed.
Hi, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. After watching this video, you should be able to describe the kinds of unconformities, all three of them. You should be able to describe how each of them forms, and you should be able to recognize them when you see them. So let's begin at Sicker Point on the coast of Scotland. It was here that James Hutton first realized the depth of geologic time because he spotted an angular unconformity. So to understand an angular unconformity, let's walk through a series of steps here. These steps are illustrated in this figure in your textbook, but let's take a look at each piece independently. So we start off by building up sedimentary layers, and we can build those up basically one at a time. So the sandstone here would have been deposited first, then the limestone, then the red shale, then the black shale, and then the upper cross-bedded sandstone. But then that whole sequence would have had to have been arched upwards so that it would be exposed to erosion. So erosion went to work on it, carved away at the uppermost bits, and created an erosional surface which cut across those different layers. Then the area was submerged below sea level again, and new layers accumulated, another black shale, another red shale, and another cross-bedded sandstone in this case. So basically what we've ended up producing is an angular unconformity. So if we go back to Sicker Point, what you're looking at here is something like this. So the angular unconformity runs from the lower left towards the upper right across the middle of the image. Below the angular unconformity, the rock layers are pretty much vertical. Those are sandstones and shales. And then above the unconformity, so here's the unconformity here, above that you can see the sedimentary layering is going across something like that. So in order to produce this, you first would have had to have deposited the lower beds as horizontal layers. Then you'd have to tilt them upright. Then they would have to be eroded. Then you'd have to deposit the upper layers, again in a horizontal orientation, and then those would have to be tilted and then eroded to produce the outcrop pattern that we see today. So when Hutton saw this, he realized, wow, geologic time must be really, really vast in order for all of this to have played out. There are two other kinds of unconformities. One is a disconformity. Disconformities have horizontal sedimentary rocks below the erosional surface and horizontal sedimentary rocks above the erosional surface. So here basically the layers are parallel above and below the unconformity. There's also a nonconformity, and with nonconformities you basically are dealing not with sedimentary rocks below the unconformity surface, but instead with metamorphic or igneous rocks. And then above those you have horizontal sedimentary layers. So that's an example of a nonconformity. Okay, so angular unconformity, disconformity, and nonconformity are the three main kinds of unconformities. All three of them appear in the Grand Canyon. So see if you can spot them here in this image. Let's go ahead and start off by taking a look at this one right here, down at the bottom. So you can see there's igneous and metamorphic rock, Vishnu schist, and Zoroaster granite below that unconformity surface, and then there's layers of the Unkar group above it. So what kind of unconformity is that? Hopefully you said a nonconformity, because there's igneous or metamorphic rocks below. Very good. Okay, let's take a look at another example here. How about this one, where you've got the tilted layers of the Unkar group below, and then horizontal layers of the Tapete sandstone and the Bright Angel shale above that. Well, that's a pretty easy one to pick out, right? Because the sedimentary layers make an angle with respect to one another. So that's an example of an angular unconformity. And then lastly, we have two examples where we've got horizontal sedimentary layers below and horizontal sedimentary layers above. Here's one between the Muav and the Red Wall limestone, and here's one between the Red Wall and the overlying Supai group. So you've only got one option left, so it probably isn't going to take a whole lot of thought for you guys to call that out as a disconformity. Those are both examples of disconformities. Good job. Thanks very much for your attention.
So as you saw from the video, we have the three different types of unconformities. We have the non-conformity, the angular conformity, and the disconformity. You know, like he mentioned in the video, the angular unconformities are the easiest to pick out because this is when we have some type of crustal deformation and we get these layers that are going to be not in horizontal layers. So we're going to have actually an angle where the uplifted layers meet the horizontal layers. So that's going to be our angular unconformity. And then the non-conformity is when we're looking at different types of rocks. So here we have the granite and the Vishnu schist here, and you have then those being adjacent to the sedimentary layers. So this is a non-conformity, and so this is when you basically get this uplift or this intrusion of the metamorphic and igneous rocks that are coming into the sedimentary rocks. And then a disconformity is still between horizontal layers, but we don't have this perfect break. So if you look at the Coconino sandstone here and the Hermit shale, the joint between them, or the barrier between them, is a perfect horizontal line. And then if you look down here between the Red Wall limestone and the Moab limestone, it's this kind of jagged, crooked line. And so what happened is the Moab limestone was laid down. And before we got to the Red Wall limestone, some of the Moab limestone had been eroded. So you don't have a perfectly, 180-degree straight angle here. You've got some little dips and grooves there, and that's our disconformity. So now we look at, okay, so we understand what the types of unconformities are. We look at our 5 principles of relative dating, our principle of superposition, original horizontality, lateral continuity, inclusions, and cross-cutting relationships. So we look at those 5 principles, we look at our unconformities, and we can determine relative dating. We can look at and determine which event happened first, so which is the oldest event, all the way up to which is the youngest event. And you're going to be doing some of this in the lab this week, of looking at what are our oldest rock layers and what events happened in the most recent history. Again, this is relative dating. We don't have a timeline for this. We can't say, well, this happened, 250 million years ago. We just can put them in order of what happened first versus what happened last. So now we'll have a smart figure video on how we can apply the principles of relative dating to unconformities and be able to, rank these in age.
This is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another Smart Figure. In this video, we're going to take a look at how you deduce the geologic history of a region based on the principles of relative dating, and we're going to give you an opportunity to try your hand at it. So this is an image in your book that basically walks you through the many, many steps that you have to kind of think about in order to work out the geological history of a region. This is a hypothetical region. We've got this beautiful block diagram view of everything that's gone on. You want to walk your mind through this at least once or twice so that you get a sense of how these things work. And I'm sure you'll get an opportunity to practice this in lab if your class has a lab associated with it. So we want to end up here with this final block diagram, which is the most complex, but we're going to start by going with the simplest one. The simplest one is over here on the left part of the diagram, and you see it's basically just got several layers. A, B, C, and E. The letters here are somewhat arbitrary, but they end up basically giving a final sequence that is in order. So these are just sedimentary layers, deposition in some sort of a watery environment, perhaps. Okay, so here's where the D comes in. The D is coming in the form of a sill, and that sill is basically magma that intrudes between pre-existing sedimentary layers. So basically this magma oozes in between C and E and pops E upwards. Next up, we get the intrusion of a dike. That dike is labeled F, and it cuts across all the previous layers. So the principle of cross-cutting relationships tells us the dike has to be younger than everything else. Now we tilt all of our sedimentary layers away from horizontal, so they're now dipping off towards the left, and we erode rock off the top. If that whole block then subsides below sea level, new sedimentary layers can be deposited on top of that erosional surface. That produces an angular unconformity there. And so layers G, H, I, J, and K are above the unconformity surface, and every other layer, A through F, is below the unconformity. Finally, we bring that up to the surface, and you can see it is being etched out, so there's a new landscape forming on top, and the next chapter is being written. Okay, why don't you try your hand at it here. What's the sequence of events that would have to take place in order to produce this cross-section? Hopefully you identify that the green stuff down here at the bottom is probably going to be the oldest. You can see that with those squiggles and wiggles, that's likely metamorphic rock, so that's probably produced at the roots of some ancient mountain range. Then you'd have to bring that up to the surface and erode it off so that you could then end up depositing sedimentary layers on top of it. And so you deposit some sedimentary layers, call them 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the next step is going to be the intrusion of some igneous units. Now we've got several different igneous units here. We've got a dike here, let's call this dike A, and we've got a dike here, let's call that B, and we've got another dike over here called C, and then we've got this great big pluton, which we'll call D. So which of these came first? Well, you can see that C cuts across D, so it's got to be younger than D. D ends up cutting across this little offshoot of A, so D has got to be younger than A, and B cuts across A. So B's got to be younger than A. So A's got to be the oldest among these. So A cuts through our metamorphic rocks. It cuts through layer 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the next thing that's going to take place is going to be D. So D will go next because D cuts across dike A. And then C cuts across D. Now, all of those then are basically brought to the surface and erosion takes place. So we end up basically producing an unconformity that goes across something like that. And that cuts across all those igneous units as well as our sedimentary units. After the unconformity, new units are deposited. Let's call them 5, 6, and 7. They're deposited on top as sedimentary layers. And then after that, we end up getting a fault. That fault breaks through all the units so far, and then the very last thing is the eruption of this volcano coming up through dike B, and then a lava flow coming onto the surface here. Notice that the lava flow is not offset along the fault. So that's the sort of thinking you need to employ in order to work out the geological history of a region. Thank you very much for your attention. This has been another Smart Figure.
So as you saw there, we can use all of our different principles of relative dating to determine relative ages. So we will work on some of this in the lab when you come in this week and look at how we can determine the oldest versus youngest layers. And so you were able to see some of that there in the video. So now kind of switching gears, something else that we can use to help us determine the ages, determining both the numerical dates and relative dates, are fossils. So fossils are the remains or traces of prehistoric life that have been preserved in rock and primarily in sediment or sedimentary rocks. Paleontology is the scientific study of fossils. So of course, we have paleontologists who are working to, extract these different fossils. It blends both geology and biology because at one time these organisms were alive. But they can serve as important time indicators. They help us also understand what the conditions were like in the past. Now, there are several different types of fossils, and I'm going to jump ahead here to this image. This is on page 358 in your book. This shows the different types of fossils that are possible. So as we look at this, if we look at those that are relatively recent, their remains may not have been altered at all. Teeth, bones, shells are common examples of that. Far less common actually are being able to have entire organisms, although it does happen. We had during one of the last ice ages, we had entire mammoths that were preserved in Siberia and Alaska because the conditions changed and it was just right to strand these animals, and they died, and we were able to basically extract these whole organisms. But some of the other types of fossilization that we have, the first one here represented is petrified wood, and this occurs through a process of permineralization. When you have a situation where you've got some type of living organism like that, or remains of a living organism like bone, or you have wood, and you think, well, what about wood? Why is that important? Well, of course, wood still remains of living organisms. Plants, a lot of times I think people think about fossils as always just being animals, but that's not the case. Plants can also leave fossils. So petrified wood created through this process of permineralization. So when you have groundwater, particularly groundwater that is rich in different types of minerals that comes in and permeates porous tissue like bone or wood, the minerals are going to basically precipitate out of the solution. So they're not going to stay contained within the water, and they're going to fill in all of those pores and holes, and that's called permineralization. In the case of petrified wood, which you've got this example here, it involves permineralization with silica, typically from some type of volcanic source. Petrified means turned into stone. So these minerals basically take this living tissue and turn it into stone. So it becomes like a rock. Another example we have are molds and casts. And you see this here with the trilobite. When a shell or another structure is buried in sediment and then it's dissolved, you get the mold. And that reflects the shape and structure of the organism. Of course, only the external structure is preserved here. If those hollow spaces, so if the molds are filled with some type of mineral matter, it creates a cast. And so here's the mold here. So in other words, this was a trilobite that was here, and it died for whatever reason, was buried here, and then dissolved. So we just see the mold of what it was. Then that came along and was filled with mineral matter, and so we get the cast over here on the left. Carbonization is another type of fossilization. This preserves leaves and delicate animal forms, and you see here we have a bee that's been preserved here. When fine sediment encases the remains of the organism, and then pressure squeezes out the liquid and leaves behind carbon. So carbon is found in all living organisms. So we can get, like this, like insects, very delicate animals, as well as plants that are formed like this. So black shale deposited as mud in oxygen poor environments often contain a lot of these carbonized remains. If the film of carbon is lost, then you get a replica called an impression. So in this example, the carbon is still there. That's why it kind of appears black. But in this example of the fish, these are impressions. The carbon has been washed away, but the impression of those organisms still remains. And then, of course, we have amber, which was made famous in, the Jurassic Park movies, where they found a mosquito encased in amber. But amber is the resin that comes from trees. And if an animal, primarily insects, gets caught up in this resin, then when it hardens, it becomes amber. And you've got this perfectly preserved specimen within amber. The resin protects it. It seals it off, protects it from the atmosphere and damage by water and air. Then we can have trace fossils. We can have tracks. So we get animal footprints that were in soft sediment and later turned into sedimentary rock. And we can have burrows, so the remains of, the burrows of animals. We can have coprolites, which you see in this last example down here. This is an example of a trace fossil that is actually fossil dung, so poop that was left behind. And then we can get gastroliths. Gastroliths refers to these stomach stones that were used by ancient animals, by dinosaurs and other organisms to help grind their food. So this past summer, I had the opportunity to go out west, and I've mentioned my vacation out west before, but we stopped at a place in New Mexico that had dinosaur tracks. And so these essentially were fossilized tracks that the dinosaurs made. And then, as that sediment was compressed into rock, it hardened and preserved those tracks. So I want to show you some pictures that I took while we were there of these different dinosaur tracks. So here are some pictures that I took. And again, this was in northeastern New Mexico, and it had rained the day that we got there. So some of them are filled with water. But basically you see all of these different dinosaur tracks in here where the dinosaurs actually walked. And these were preserved in fossil form. And you can tell that there's been erosion. And what happened here is they were building a dam or getting ready to build a dam. And so they were removing some of the rock layers, because you can see some of the rock layers here in the background that would have been on top, deposited, after these tracks were made. And when they were cutting away these rock layers, they discovered the dinosaur tracks underneath and then preserved them. So this was a really neat thing to see. I'd never seen anything like this before, and being able to see, these tracks where dinosaurs actually walked was, that was a pretty neat thing for me. And you can see the different sizes. Obviously, there were all different types of dinosaurs that lived here and walked here, and some of them perfectly preserved. And then I took some pictures of some of the different rock layers there, because I thought this was interesting how we could really see, like as they were cutting away to build this dam, we could really see these different rock layers, and it took the removal of these rock layers to be able to discover these dinosaur tracks. And so we were kind of like in a little pit here where they had removed these rock layers. And so the dinosaur tracks were down at the bottom. And this is something that we're going to see. This idea here of having to remove these rock layers to be able to get to the dinosaur tracks underneath allows us to have what we call correlation, or being able to look at rock layers across different locations. Because if we were to go into different areas around where this was in northeastern New Mexico, we would find similar things. We would have to extract the rock down to this particular layer, and we would be able to find similar tracks where the dinosaurs lived. And that allows us to correlate rocks using fossils. So we look at the rock layers, we look at the fossils. Something else we would see if we were looking at our principles of relative dating, and we could correlate these rock layers with rock layers all around the area. So this allows us to be able to relative date, but also numerically date different rock layers. So this figure from your textbook, which is on page 359, shows us how we can Correlate Rocks. So we've got Grand Canyon National Park, Zion National Park, and Bryce Canyon National Park. And so here you can see where these are located. Grand Canyon National Park over in northwestern Arizona, and then Zion and Bryce Canyon in southern Utah. And what we find is that we've got a lot of the same layers of rocks. They're just not all visible because of the difference in erosion and weathering. So if we look at Grand Canyon National Park, okay, we look at the top few layers here that we see, the Kaibab Landstone and the Moenkopi here, and we can see those exact same layers in Zion. We don't see the ones underneath because they're not exposed. They haven't been eroded yet. They're still there. We would find these exact same layers underneath if erosion were to expose them. And then we move over to Bryce Canyon and we see the Navajo sandstone. We see a real thick layer of that. We don't see any of these others because, again, we haven't gotten erosion that has exposed those. And so, but what we can do is correlate these, and that helps us to be able to find fossils and then be able to date these and to know that, this Kaibab limestone here was laid down in this entire area. It isn't unique just to Grand Canyon. We're going to find Kaibab limestone all over this Four Corners region here. So that's correlation. And this is a little bit easier to do in a limited geographic area like we see here. When we can study the outcrops of rocks, we can have geologists that go in and study and map out these different rock layers and then be able to correlate them within a certain geographical area. But as we cross geographical areas where we have areas that are not all connected and located close together, then we have to turn to our fossils and use our fossils to help us correlate. And this goes along with what we call the principle of fossil succession, in that fossil organisms succeed one another in a definite and determinable order, and therefore any time period can be recognized by its fossil content. So even if we can't see the exposure of the rocks and correlate them that way, we can use the fossil record to help us correlate. So now we'll watch another smart figure on fossil assemblage and how we can use that for correlation.
Hi, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another smart figure. In this video, we're going to take a look at how the ranges of different fossil organisms can help us figure out when a package of sedimentary rock formed. After watching the video, you should be able to use this same set of skills to bracket the age of a sedimentary rock. So the first thing to realize is that there are a bunch of different kinds of fossils. Fossils are the remains or traces of ancient organisms, and they come in many forms. One of the things that we've established about fossils is that they show up in certain ages of rocks and not in rocks that are older than that or younger than that. So in other words, the organisms evolved at some point and then they went extinct at some point. And obviously this isn't true for every organism because there's still some organisms alive today, so not everything has gone extinct. What we can do is we can plot these sort of start and end for every organism. So each organism has an oldest layer that we find it in and then a youngest layer that we find it in. So let's take a look at how this can be used to figure out the ages of sedimentary rocks. Let's first consider this rock unit here, this pink stratum called A. Now this is evidently a very unusual rock unit because it's got both terrestrial organisms like this sycamore leaf and this fern and this dinosaur, as well as marine organisms like this scallop and this sea star. Each of those organisms has a range, and you can see, for instance, the scallop first shows up in the fossil record down here, and then it's still alive today. The fern, as we already looked at, has a shorter range. The dinosaur's range is bracketed there. The sycamore leaf like that, and then the sea star would be like that. So the key thing here is that there's only one period of time when all 5 of those organisms overlap. And for all 5 of them to be present in the same rock, they all had to be alive when that rock was deposited. So when were they all alive? It's this little zone in here that is highlighted with the color pink. And you can see that some of these organisms are better than others at constraining the age of those rocks. The sea star and the scallop don't really do us much good here because they span so much time. But the key organisms here are going to be the dinosaur and the sycamore leaf, because the dinosaur is the first one to go extinct, and the sycamore is the last organism to show up. So those end up basically bracketing that period of time when that rock must have been deposited. Okay, here's another example. Down here, a blue rock unit, and you can see it's got fossils of a trilobite, a fern, a brachiopod, a scallop, and a sea star. The one time when all 5 of those organisms overlap is outlined here in blue. Notice that the trilobite is the very first one to go extinct. So that basically gives us the minimum age of the rock unit. And the fern is the last one to show up in the sedimentary record. So that gives us the maximum age. So the rock unit must be between those 2 ages. So this is where the traditional periods of the geologic timescale come from. They were basically established by looking at the ranges of different fossil organisms, the period of time between when the organism first shows up and when it last shows up in the sedimentary sequence. It was only later that we were able to add radiometric ages to the geologic timescale and to give some definition to the Pre-Cambrian, which for the most part doesn't have fossils of macroscopic or easily visible organisms.
So what you're seeing here is the geologic time scale that is in your book on page 376. And so we have this Precambrian age, and then we have our Phanerozoic age. Actually, 376 is in the next chapter, sorry. 366 in this chapter, the same figures on page 376 as well. And you heard him mention there radiometric dating, being able to actually assign this time period to it. And in your book, on pages 361 through 365, we get a little bit more information about radiometric dating. There is a smart figure on page 362, figure 11.21, that has a video that explains radiometric dating and half-life. So I would encourage you to watch that so you understand how we got these time periods here. But we can use radiometric dating and use it even on fossils to help us determine how many millions of years ago something existed. And that's where those times come from. We can use uranium, we can use potassium, we can use carbon to help us identify these ages. Now, what you'll see here, if you look at the structure of the time scale, you see these eons here. So currently we're in the Phanerozoic eon, which means visible life. And then the Precambrian, like he mentioned here, we had mostly microscopic organisms. Eons are then divided into eras. And so if we look at the Phanerozoic era eon, we see 3 eras: Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic. So Cenozoic means recent life, Mesozoic, middle life, and Paleozoic, ancient life. And so then we can break the eons down into periods. You see there, if we just enlarge that, we see, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, and how we can divide those down into periods. Each of these periods is characterized by a less profound change in the life forms. And then the periods can be divided into epochs or epochs. And as you see, we don't have the ones divided into Mesozoic and Paleozoic, but if we look at the Cenozoic, you notice they all end in CENE there. And we can divide these, but they're not as specific as we see in the Cenozoic. We know more about the Cenozoic because that is the most recent. We've been able to study it a little bit more. If we look at the Precambrian period here, much less detailed because we don't know as much about what happened here. The Precambrian represents about 88% of Earth history, and we just don't know it in enough detail to really subdivide it like we have the Phanerozoic era.
Okay, why don't we give you an opportunity to try this out. Notice that I've put the geologic timescale over here next to our age ranges of some different fossil groups. We're going to go ahead and give you a couple of example rocks. Here's one right here. This rock contains a fossil of the dinosaur and the sea star in it. So how old is that rock to have both of those fossils in it? Well, hopefully you've established that the sea star has this range, the dinosaur has this range. The overlap between them is basically the entire span when the dinosaur was alive. So we would be going over here, and that would be somewhere in the Cretaceous, Jurassic, or Triassic. In other words, during the Mesozoic era of geologic time. Here's another rock sample. This one has sea stars in it as well, but also a trilobite fossil. Sea stars, again, basically have a range that spans like that, and then the trilobites range is like that. So the overlap between them is basically like this, and that constrains our age to sometime between the Ordovician and the Permian for that particular rock. So obviously these aren't too tightly constrained, but I think you get the idea that the overlap in the ranges is the key thing that we need to look for.
So this gives you an idea about how we can use fossils to identify how old certain rocks are, because we can look at the overlap of the organisms that we find in the fossil record. So that brings us to the end of chapter 11. As we get into chapter 12, we're going to discuss Earth's history a little bit more in detail, come back to our geologic time scale here, and get into this a little bit more in detail as far as how we can look at different events in Earth's history.